episode number 115. You can get all the show notes and resources at dadhackers.us/115. What's up, Dad Hackers? My name is Patrick Antonucci, and I am the host and founder of this podcast and community of Dad Hackers. Dad Hackers is a community of Christian fathers who are devoted to encouraging, equipping, and enabling one another to become the men that God has created and called us to be, so that we can raise up the next generation of fully devoted followers of Christ and leave a legacy of multi-generational faithfulness. Now, on this show, we primarily interview Christian men to dive deep into their experiences and insights into what it means to be a Christian man, a Christian husband, a Christian father, and a Christian leader. We ask questions that dig deep into the thinking and rationale and experiences of these men so that we can all learn and grow into the men that God is calling us to be. I'm so thankful that you've joined us today. Make sure you subscribe so that you never miss any of our value-packed episodes. Also, please make sure you leave an honest review if you're listening to this in iTunes or any other platform that takes reviews. Reviews boost the show's ratings, which means that more dads are going to come across our show and benefit from the content that we put out. I also wanted to let you know that we do have a free private Facebook group just for Christian dads. So after the show, make sure you hop on over to the show notes. There's a link for that in there as well. What's up, guys? Today I have a special treat for you. I recently was asked by Troy with Revived Thoughts podcast. He's one of the co-hosts of that podcast, to actually read a sermon. Now, on their podcast, they go back and read old sermons from guys, preachers of the likes of Jonathan Edwards, Bonhoeffer, Spurgeon, and many others, just to bring them back to life. They release a new episode every Thursday of sermons like these. And a lot of guys are getting a lot of benefit from listening to these old sermons. You know, it's one thing to read a sermon or read a quote from a sermon, but to hear it actually be preached, even though it's not from the original preacher, and hear it read and kind of performed, if you will, takes the sermon to a whole new level. Now, Troy reached out to me and said, hey, why don't we collaborate? Why don't you read a sermon about fatherhood for Father's Day, and I'll get you that sermon, and you read it. We'll put it on my podcast, and you can put it on your podcast. And I was like, man, that is a great idea. And how Troy and I actually got connected is I recently became a partner, not a partner, but actually a member of the Christian podcast community. This is a network of podcasters that are all faith-based podcasters. And so if you're not heard of the Christian podcast community, go ahead and Google it and check it out. I'll probably put a link for that in the show notes so you can check it out. Lots of good podcasts on there. And you'll see the Dad Hackers podcast on there as well. So without further ado, I'm going to read this sermon. It's called Castaway Preacher and Indulgent Father. It was originally by Alexander Whyte, and it's an in-depth look at Eli and his failures as a father. Where Eli seems to have failed, we can learn about what true fatherhood should look like. Okay, this is Castaway Preacher and the Indulgent Father by Alexander Whyte, and it's an in-depth look at Eli and his failures as a father. Where Eli seems to have failed, we can learn about what true fatherhood should look like. And we'll start this with a scripture reading. Now, Eli was very old and heard all that his sons did to all Israel, and how they lay with the women that assembled at the door of the tabernacle and of the congregation. And he said to them, why do you do such things? For I hear of your evil dealings by all this people. No, my sons, for it is no good report that I hear you. You make the Lord's people to transgress. If one man sins against another, the judge will judge him. But if a man sins against the Lord, who will entreat for him? But they did not listen to the voice of their father. because the Lord would slay them. 1 Samuel chapter 2, verses 22 through 25. Do you know a man that is hasty in his words? There is more hope for a fool than of him. Eli thought she was drunk, and Eli said to her, "How long will you be drunk? Put away your wine from you." 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 14. Yes, but we have hope of Eli in spite of his hasty words. For Eli never forgave himself for his hasty words to Hannah. Eli had many bitter memories as he sat by the wayside watching for the ark of God. And one of the bitterest of those memories was the lasting memory of his insulting language to Hannah. No sooner had that hasty word gone out of Eli's mouth than he would have given all the world to have had that hasty word back again. "Go in peace," Eli said, "and let the God of Israel grant you your petition, which you have asked of him." In all his days, in his sore remorse for what he had said to Samuel's mother before Samuel was born, Eli tried to make up for that insult to Samuel, her son. Eli's extraordinary care over young Samuel, his extraordinary tenderness toward the child, and as Samuel grew up, the oldest priest's secret fear over Samuel, and his growing reverence for him. He had done it all in an attempt to undo the insult and the injury he had done to Samuel's mother. Samuel was predestined soon to succeed all Eli's forfeited offices. All Eli's high positions were soon to descend to Samuel. And Eli saw all that was preparing to come about, and preparing to come about soon. But all that did not alter or abate by one iota Eli's notable goodness to Samuel. Eli could not have treated Hophni or Phinehas better than he had treated Samuel, his immediate successor. Frederick Robertson, in his apology for Eli, makes a great deal of the total absence of envy in Eli. My tongue would be cleaving to the roof of my mouth with envy. I would be as blind with envy as Eli was blind with old age. The hair may have fallen off my head till I am bald with envy, and yet no man about me would so much as guess it. What Eli is to be praised for is not that he felt no envy of Samuel, but rather than feeling envy every day, as he could not fail to see it, he kept his envy down and did not let it come out in his treatment of Samuel. Of course, Eli had envy of Samuel. All men have envy in their hearts who are placed by God in Eli's circumstances. And it is misleading and mischievous for any preacher to say anything else. God alone could say whether Eli had envy or not. And he never says that about Eli or any other man. He says about Eli and all men the very opposite. The point with God is not whether I have envy or not, but it is how I deal with the envy that he knows I have. All that my fellow men can see in me is not the envy of my heart, but that of my life. They can see and hear whether or not I backbite and belittle and detract and depreciate, or whether I consent and take part in pleasure with them who do. And while that is much to see and to judge, it is far from being all. If John the Baptist had no envy and no jealousy of his fast-rising cousin, then he has less praise for his noble reply to his envious and jealous disciples. But if the forerunner had to fast from his locusts to help him to subdue his pride, and if it was only after many unwitnessed days and nights of sweat and prayer and blood that he was enabled to hand over John and Andrew to Jesus, whom he had baptized but yesterday beyond the Jordan, well then John the Baptist is of some use to you and me. But if John had no such envy and no such jealousy himself as his disciples had on his account, then he was not a man of like passions as we are. If John did not sometimes find himself hating Jesus in his heart till in his agony he threw himself over the bleeding rocks of the wilderness, then all I can say is that Elizabeth's sanctified son was not made of the same rotten stuff as you and me. For not only had Eli, with all his envy, a very real and very deep love for little Samuel, but along with that, and kept alive by that, he had a real and living and a deep faith in God. and in God's voices, in visions, in answers to men. There was Eli's fine benediction spoken over Hannah the next moment after he had mistaken her for a daughter of Belial, and his open-hearted adoption of little Samuel to be his assistant and successor in the temple service, and his rich benediction pronounced on Samuel's mother because she had lent little Samuel to the Lord. Then there was his midnight lesson to his little elect companion, in his solemn demand the next morning to be told what the Lord had said to the prophetic child during the night, and his instant acceptance of the terrible message that Samuel was compelled to deliver. It all shows us that Eli, with all his shipwreck of life and opportunity and privilege, understood the root of the matter all the time. There had been no open visions for a long time in Israel, but Eli's mind had been open all that time. You will see men with great faults and even with completely lost and wasted lives, who yet through it all and to the end have a certain openness of mind to divine truth, and a certain confidence and spontaneous sympathy with divine truth when it comes. And through those it speaks. And poor old Eli was one of those open-minded and truth-loving men. If his own sins and his son's sins had shut silent the divine vision, then Eli was all the more prepared to believe that the divine vision would hereafter speak to better man than he had been. And when the divine vision did begin to break its long silence and to speak again, for Eli to accept that vision, even when it came in the shape of a sentence of capital punishment on himself and on his house, well, if ever faith had her perfect work in an open mind, it was surely in Castaway Eli's open mind. There is a lesson here, and what a noble example to all old castaway among us. The Spirit and the providence of God and His church have stood still in our day. There has been nothing to call an open vision. We have sinned away the open vision. We have quenched the speaking Spirit. Let us expect then for our successors what we have sinned away from ourselves. Let us believe and be sure that the coming generation will see visions and hear God's voice that we have not been counted worthy to see or to hear because of our great unfaithfulness and unfruitfulness, and because of our great blindness and disobedience. And then, look at old Eli's splendid resignation and Gethsemane-like submission. It is the Lord. Let him do what good to him. I will never believe that Eli is lost. Broken neck and dead sons and daughters lying all around him, the ark taken, the temple in ruins, and the glory departed. And all this is true, but Eli is not lost. No man is wholly lost who lies lost before God like that. Though he slay me, said Job, but he did not slay Job as he slew Eli. Job's patience and meekness and submission and resignation were tried terribly, but they were not tried down to the death as Eli was. And he who so rewarded Job and who supported and rewarded his own son, no, I will not believe it till I see it that Eli is among the reprobate. It is the Lord. If anything will cover a multitude of sins, and if anything will draw down mercy of God, surely that cry of Eli's will do it. Way back at the beginning of his life, Eli had taken far too much in hand. Eli was not a great man like Moses or Aaron, but he took both the office of Moses and the office of Aaron upon his single self. Eli was both the chief judge and the high priest for the whole house of Israel. The blessed, the most laborious, the most devoted, the most tireless and sleepless of men could not have done what Eli undertook to do. They called Origen brazen bowels. He was such a sleepless student. But Eli would have needed both bowels of brass and a head and a heart of gold to have done half of what he set out to do. In taking up what was beyond mortal power to perform, the certain result was that he did nothing well, but did everything poorly. Both his high priesthood at the altar, and his chief judgeship at the gate, and his sole fatherhood in his own house, both God's house and his own house, and the whole house of Israel, went to wreck and ruin under the overburdened Eli. It is startling and terrible to think that the unparalleled catastrophe of Eli's awful end had its first and far back roots in what is as much a virtue surely as a vice, his determination to do two men's work with his own hands. But whatever Eli's motives were for loading himself with all these offices and emoluments, the terrible catastrophe of his own end and his son's end and the end of Shiloh and all its earliest roots in Eli's vaulting ambition, and the consequent incapacity and neglect, the mischief was widespread. But it was at the home that the widespread mischief rose to a height that went beyond human remedy and beyond divine forgiveness. And may something of that same kind not be the explanation of some of those sad cases where the houses of able and good and devoted ministers come to such ruin. With so many public demands and claims, and with such incessant calls and encroachments at all hours of the day and night, there is neither time nor strength to do any part of a minister's work as it should be done. And one worried week follows another worried week till his children grow up and grow out of his knowledge. A bishop must be vigilant, yes, but a bishop in our day would need to have 100 eyes and 100 hands and 100 feet. He must rule well the house of God. Yes, but the apostle tells Timothy that they must know how to rule his own house first. It is a fine picture, one that rules his own house, having his children in subjection with all sincerity. It would almost seem that Paul had had the ruins of Eli's house before his mind when he wrote that fine instruction. All other men have grave, sweet Sabbath day to spend with their children, ruling and teaching them, all but the ministers and policemen and some others. But ministers have neither Saturday nor Sabbath nor Monday. And I never hear them complaining of that, unless it is when they think of their children. We call Eli old and blind and idle and inefficient and ignorant and neglectful of his own children, of God's people. And so he was. But all that was not because he did nothing, but because he did too much to do anything well, till at last, broken in life and broken in heart, with his nation and his church and his household lying all in ruins around him, we see Eli sitting by the wayside waiting for death, a terrible end to such a bold and ambitious beginning. Now the sons of Eli were sons of Baal. They didn't know the Lord. Impossible, you would protest, if it were not for the Bible. But just because it's in the Bible, we are compelled to ask ourselves how it could possibly come about that the sons of such a sacred man as Eli could ever become sons of Baal. What? Not know the Lord, and they were born and brought up within the very precincts of the Lord's house? Did they not hear the praises of God in his sanctuary? Were not the first sights they saw was their father in his robes beside the altar, with all the tables and the bread and the sacrifices and the incense around him? And yet, there it is in black and white. There it is in blood and tears. The sons of Eli were sons of Baal. They didn't know the Lord. Let me think. Let me consider well how, conceivably, it would come about that Hophni and Phinehas could be born and brought up at Shiloh and not know the Lord. Well, for one thing, their father was never at home. What with judging all Israel, and what with sacrificing and interceding for all Israel, Eli never saw his children till they were in their beds. What does this mean? All the other children ask their fathers as they come up to the temple, and all the way up and all the way down again, those fathers took their inquiring children by the hand and told them all about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and Moses and the Exodus and all the wilderness, the promised land conquest, and the yearly Passover. Hophni and Phinehas were the only children in all Israel who saw the temple every day and paid no attention to it. And every father and mother knows this, how the years run away and how their children grow up till all of a sudden they are as tall as themselves. And how much faster than our tallest children did Eli's children grow up. All things, indeed, were coming together against Eli. The very early ripeness of his sons was against Eli. He thought he would one day have time. but it was his lifelong regret that he had never had the time. And there was always one thing, and then another. And with their father's preoccupation and their own evil hearts, the two young men were already sons of Baal when they should have been little children. Why do you do such things? For I hear of all your evil dealings by all these people. No, my sons, this is no good report that I hear about you. Like our own proverb, Eli is seen trying to shut the stable door with many tears and sobs years and years after the horses have broken out. I've spoken of Job. Well, I always think that Job was the very best father in all the Old Testament, while Eli was surely the very worst. Let this passage from Job be repeated to himself by every father every day from the first day he is a father. This golden passage by Job was one that pleased God and eschewed evil. And it was so, when the days of their feasting were over, that Job sent and sanctified them. And he rose up early in the morning and offered burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." And so Job did continuously. Our old ministers, when they had a father at the pulpit, used to make him swear that he would pray both with and for his children. Now it was right here that Eli went wrong. And it is just here that so many of ourselves go wrong, and we lose our children. We scold and scowl at them, and we beat and bruise and lock them up, when we should pray both with them and for them. If, when they tell a lie, or steal, or speak bad language, or strike another, or defiantly disobey us, we would neither lift a hand nor a tongue at them, but would take them to our place of prayer, and there pray both with and for them. As sure as I stand here and you sit there, there would be fewer sons and daughters of Baal in our houses. Let us do it. Let us, unlike Eli tonight, go home and do this. And if our children are grown up and gone away, let us all the more go after them, like Job with that sacrifice and that persistence, which have the promise and the power to apprehend them and to bring them back. So Job did continually. You will all have it well in your mind how this all ended, how the ark of God was taken, and how the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were slain, and how Eli, when he heard the evil tidings, fell from the seat off backwards, and his neck broke, and he died. And how his daughter-in-law, her pains came upon her, but she didn't answer it, and how she named her son Ichabod, and so died. Ichabod, a name that meant the glory of God had departed from Israel. All right, guys, there you have it. There is the sermon read for you in whole by Alexander Whyte. This is Castaway Preacher and Indulgent Fathers. And I want to remind, Indulgent Father, excuse me. And I want to remind you to check out the Revived Thoughts podcast with Troy and his co-host. Every week, like I said earlier, they release a episode where they reread an old sermon from one of the great preachers of old. Excellent stuff they have going on there. I encourage you to check it out, as well as the Christian podcast community for more Christian, Christ-centered podcasts. All right, guys, that's it. All right, gentlemen, that's all we have for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope our conversation was a blessing to you and that you leave this episode better equipped to be the man and the father God has called and created you to be. If so, then I ask that you please leave us a 5-star rating and a quick written review in iTunes. Then make sure you head on over to the show notes to get all of the resources for this episode. While you're there, you can take part in our 5 Days to Be a Better Dad challenge, as well as get involved with our free Facebook community. All right, gentlemen, until next week, remember Proverbs 27:17. As iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. Stay sharp.